It is February 12th, 2026, and reports say that the U.S. is preparing to deploy a second aircraft carrier to the Middle East for potential strikes on Iran as Trump and Netanyahu wrapped up yet another meeting in Washington, D.C. A meeting that was followed by vague statements from Trump himself, but that, according to reports, saw Trump telling Netanyahu that he wanted to try negotiations with Iran before they took military action. So, does he mean it? Can he stick to that? Or is he just saying that, and is it just being reported because the US is still trying to get the military assets in place for an attack? Well, we got into all of the latest and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a defense and foreign policy analyst and former Pentagon advisor. Colonel Macgregor, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Sure.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as I know that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu made yet another trip to the US this week for talks with President Trump. And this time, of course, amid ongoing tensions with Iran. And it seems like every time these two get together, they're plotting some sort of an attack. But in this case, you have Axios reporting that during Wednesday's 3-hour meeting, Trump said he wants to keep pursuing a deal with Iran rather than moving to military action at this time. So, what do you make of this report? Could that be the truth, or could this also be a smokescreen for the next U.S. attack?
Well, based on our experience thus far, I'm not sure we should pay much attention to the public statements that are issued after the meeting. I think we have to look at what's happening as opposed to what people are saying. And what we know is that we've got another carrier battle group that is going to steam, I guess, towards the Mediterranean. And they'll take at least another 4 or 5 days to get there, maybe longer. So I think what really has happened are a number of things. First of all, I think President Trump made these threats and people kept telling him, well, that's all fine, well, and good, but we haven't enough equipment, capability, firepower in the region. And he didn't pay much attention to that. He thought he was going to essentially bluff the Iranians into some sort of deal. Now, that was based on what he and many others in Washington saw as an opportunity to destabilize, if not overthrow, the regime based on the demonstrations. And the demonstrations need to be understood because they're not widely comprehended here in the United States. Those initial demonstrations were peaceful for about 2.5, 3 days. And they consisted of people who were saying, look, the economy is terrible, the currency is being destroyed, and we want you to do something about it. The government responded initially and said, well, you're right. The economy is terrible, and we're going to do what we can to stop it. We're going to make some payments to people and other things. Then it turns out that 40,000 Starlight terminals turned up, along with Mossad and CIA agents, and they began to turn this peaceful demonstration into an opportunity to attack the government. Now, they did that by passing out a lot of money to people, handing out weapons and telling them shoot at the police. They began attacking banks, not surprisingly, given the frustration with the currency, and banks were being destroyed. And finally, the government said this is unacceptable. They had to go in and suppress it. And people say, well, they were too harsh. They shouldn't have done this, that, or the next thing. Keep in mind that when you think you're on the precipice of war, as this government does, you can't afford disruption in the streets on the scale that it was developing. And so they acted very strongly to suppress it. They didn't kill 10,000 or 15,000 people. That's an exaggeration, probably more like 3,500. They did put 3, 4, 5, 6,000 people in jail, and that number increased over time. But they did what they had to do to hold the government together, hold the society together. And I think what you've got now is a realization of two things. We're not going to change very much in terms of the way we govern ourselves in Iran until this war is over. And that's the war with the United States and Israel. Secondly, when the war ends, I think we're going to see change in Iran, more profound change than we've seen to this point. But beyond that, I think it's a mistake to assume, which is one of the key assumptions, that if we bomb the Iranians, they'll be terribly grateful for being bombed and instantly rise up to remove their government and welcome us with open arms. No, I don't think that's going to happen. So then the second part is we don't have enough firepower in the region to do much. And I think probably the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who is someone Trump trusts, obviously. After all, he was, I guess, on the board of the hedge fund run by Kushner's brother. So there's a tie there. And I think he told him in no stark terms, look, Mr. President, we need more firepower, need more time. We are still flying a lot of things into the theater. We have assembled a lot of equipment, a lot of capability. I think this is going to go forward. I don't think that President Trump can simply say, that's it, I'm not doing it. If he did that, he'd be in a lot of trouble with the people that put him in the White House. Who knows what the consequences could be for him? There are people out there suggesting that more information about him in particular could be released as a result of the Epstein files. Who knows? But the bottom line is, I don't see how he walks away from this. So I think we are going to witness an air offensive or an air campaign against Iran. And why? Well, first of all, the Iranians can't give up their ballistic missile arsenal, and that's what the Israelis want. They're not satisfied with reduced enrichment. They want no enrichment whatsoever. In other words, no evidence for any kind of nuclear work at all, and they want to get rid of the ballistic missiles, or at least create a situation where whatever Iran has, it can't reach Israel. This is not going to happen. And then they want, of course, obedience to the order that says, you will not cooperate with other Shiites in the region against us. Under those circumstances, unless we're willing to stand up and cry, wolf, and say, oh, we're sorry, we didn't really mean it, which I don't think is going to happen, we're going to see this happen. So it's a matter of timing. Will it take another 5, 6, 7 days? Probably. And at some point, it's going to happen. I don't think the so-called discussions or negotiations are going to produce an arrangement that is going to be satisfactory to Mr. Netanyahu, whom we represent. Let's keep that in mind, and Iran. So this is where we are. We're waiting.
Yeah, and as we're kind of watching these tensions continue to increase, and I think you made some really important points there, because we look back to the so-called 12-day war, and when Iran was attacked by the US and by Israel, that didn't create more divide. That actually created a lot more unity, because they saw who the enemy was, who was actively targeting their country. And I know that now Iran has made it clear that another attack from the US, even if it's a symbolic one, will lead to a regional war, and the US military bases in the region, of which there are many, will be targeted. Do you think that the US military is remotely prepared for something like that? I know, we're not talking about the US homeland being in jeopardy, but all of those bases over there getting into a full-on conflict. And is that something that you think that the Trump administration fully understands, or do they think they can just get away with another air attack and then just move on?
Well, two things. The first is this statement that you hear from General Keane and many other advocates for the destruction of Iran. They say what happened in the past indicates that anyone who may help Iran will ultimately do nothing. In other words, Iran will be alone. I don't subscribe to that viewpoint. I think the Russians have provided, will provide whatever assistance they can. Obviously, they are focused on Ukraine and ending the war there, and that's understandable. But we now also have China. And the Chinese have poured not only missiles and technology for air defense into Iran, they are providing a lot of very important real-time intelligence. So are the Russians, but the Chinese satellites are watching everything and identifying everything, targeting everything for the Iranians. So I think it's a mistake to say, well, it'll be like it has been in the past, nothing will change, and nobody will really do anything. The second part is a little more complex. I think the Iranian people are going to stick with their government, as you pointed out, however much they dislike it. Beyond that, what can we expect? I think we should be very concerned about the people in bases, the people at sea, the people everywhere, because, Rachel, we've never been under this kind of attack. I mean, you've got to go all the way back to Korea to find air combat. In other words, where our Air Force was locked in combat with the opposing North Koreans, planes flown by Russians and others at the time, and Chinese forces. we've not had to defend vast bases from missiles. We know we have limited numbers of Patriot missiles, limited numbers of THAAD missiles, limited numbers of radars. Is the equipment good? I'm sure it's good, but only for point defense. In other words, you pick an area and you can defend an area. But even then, how many missiles does the enemy have to fire at your particular base before you can't defend yourself any longer? In other words, you run out of missiles. The problem with all of this, and this is in any future warfare setting, penetrating the man's defenses is a lot easier than defending against it. That's very difficult. I went through the other day with, I've forgotten who it was now, the Kosovo air campaign. And the Kosovo air campaign is held out by people that know nothing about it as a great success story. It wasn't a success story. And 70 days, 65, 70 days into the air campaign that originally was only supposed to last a few days, a week, or maybe 2 weeks, it was recognized this is not working. So they sent Deputy Secretary of State Talbot to Moscow to negotiate a deal under which Moscow would pull its support from the Serbs, because Moscow had promised Belgrade, we'll support you with fuel and food and other things to get you through the winter. They suddenly showed up at day 60 or 70, and we made promises. I don't know what we promised, probably aid, missiles, who knows? Not missiles, but money. And so the Russians pulled the plug on Serbia. Suddenly the Serbs realized we've lost all of our energy grid. We have no capability to produce enough heat in the winter. We're going to have thousands of people who will die from exposure, maybe hundreds of thousands. We won't be able to import food. We're going to have to capitulate over Kosovo. And then the force came out of Kosovo, and the force was largely undamaged. I'm not saying nothing was hit, but I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 tanks, 10 self-propelled guns, another 50, 60 pieces of equipment wheeled for the most part, out of this large force it had at the time when they went in, over 400 armored fighting vehicles. So the air campaign itself wasn't very effective against the force on the ground. Now, how could that be? Well, it turns out that we never degraded Serbian air defenses by more than 83%. And we spent an estimated $3 billion on that air campaign. Now, Serbia is a tiny place, 8 million people max, including Kosovo. It's not a large area. There weren't a lot of really good targets. And so we started bombing bridges and highways and factories and power stations. Iran has got 93 million people in it. They have a lot more capable technology to defend that country than we did, than we had to confront in Serbia. I think there are a lot of ifs. We just don't know how this whole thing could happen, but I think the outlook is very grim. I don't think there's going to be much success because the ultimate goal is supposedly not regime change, but the disintegration of the state. In other words, we want to bomb them into a setting where they say we're finished as a nation state. We're finished as an Islamic republic. We give up, and then the place fragments, is divided. We seize the oil resources and so forth. I don't think it'll happen. In other words, I think they have a much better shot at withstanding us today than the Serbs did in 1999. But we should not underestimate the effectiveness of the air defenses. And I think there's a tendency to do that. So what you're hearing over and over and over again, just as, we watched this in February 2022. Oh, the Russians are weak. The Russians can't do this. The Russian military is terrible. It's corrupt. They don't have enough people. They can't produce the weapons. Oh, they're going to run out of new ammunition in 2 months. They're going to run out of missiles in another month. All of that went away. I hear the same things now about Iran. And I don't think it's viable. I don't think it'll work.
It's interesting how they never learn from history, right? They just keep repeating it again and again here when it comes to the US establishment. And I do want to bring the Israel angle in on this one because I think it's interesting when you're talking about this sort of dream that the establishment has. If we're going to go in there, we're going to bomb the Iranian government into oblivion, then we're going to take over. Well, a lot of eyes are on Israel, and especially on Israel's nuclear weapons and the possibility of that coming into play if we were to see a regional war break out, if we were to see Iran really hit not only the American military bases, but also Israel in particular. How do you view this position Israel is in, where you have so many fanatics there that have this dream of war with Iran, but it would be devastating for them and potentially very devastating for the region?
In 1914, when war broke out, the people of Montenegro, who are effectively Serbs, there are only about a million of them at the time, they boasted, "We and the Russians are 100 million." In other words, the Russians and we will win. I think that's the same attitude in Israel. We and 340 million Americans, we will win. That's a very dangerous position to take because this is a long way from us. There's huge problems with waging war 7,000 miles from the United States. The Israelis are very vulnerable. We will obviously do everything we can to try and stop every missile aimed at Israel, but this time there'll be many thousands of missiles. There will be no evidence for restraint. The second thing is, if this drags on for any length of time, that's indicative of failure on our part. In other words, if you're going to achieve success with this stunning, destructive air campaign, it'll happen fairly soon. What does fairly soon mean? Certainly within 2 weeks. If that doesn't happen and it continues to drag on and the missiles continue to be fired by Iran, then you're in a lot of trouble. At that point, there are lots of fence sitters who will come against you. Now, no one pays much attention to the Turks. I think that's a very serious mistake. I've always told people, just like Iran, that's a civilizational state. It represents Persian civilization, which was in its time always regarded as on a higher plane than almost anyone else in the Islamic world. But it's different from the Turks because the Turks are not indigenous, if you will, to the region. In other words, they came in later and they came out of Central Asia. They have a different background, a different language, a different culture, but they became a civilizational state representing Sunni Islam. In recent weeks, Israeli politicians have actually said they think Turkey, or Turkey as they call it now, could actually be a greater threat than Iran. Well, welcome to the real world. I told them that in 2020. I tried to tell them that in 2013, it was 2013 when I went to Israel and spoke. And I said, I understand you're all very concerned about Iran, but truthfully, Iran is not fundamentally, inherently warlike. They haven't waged war against anybody. In fact, the last people they waged war against were the Turks. Many, many years ago. This is just before the First World War and even during the First World War. So I said, you're dealing with a very different people in Turkey. And this is a nation of people that are not just martial, but they see themselves as having a destiny that involves leadership of the Islamic world. Well, now the Israelis are beginning to see in Syria that they are up against the Turks because ultimately that's part of Turkey's sphere of influence. So we don't know what would happen, but the Turks have also made it very clear that while they may have differences with the Iranians, they see no benefit to the destruction of Iran for them. They see millions of refugees pouring out of Iran looking for some place to go. And by the way, now you're beginning to see the Saudis who are saying, we will not stand by the United States and Israel on this. We will not be party to this. I think more and more of that will happen the longer the air campaign lasts. And the Chinese will not tolerate the blockade of the Straits of Hormuz. They just won't do it. And we have to understand that the other actions we're taking in Taiwan, in the Philippines, and elsewhere, we have a battery of strike missiles sitting in the northern island of Luzon in the Philippines aimed at China. Americans are not even aware that that exists. Those are theater ballistic missiles that can strike the Chinese mainland. We put them there. This ostensibly is to warn the Chinese to hands off the Philippines. No one sees any evidence that Chinese have any interest in invading the Philippines. Anybody who invades that place is nuts. We know that. You have thousands of islands. They're very nice people. It's just a waste of time. Then there's Taiwan. And if you actually put it to a vote today and ran a referendum, what do? I think the majority of people in Taiwan would vote for reunification. And in fact, the KMT, the leading party on Taiwan, that is Chiang Kai-shek's old party, advocates for peaceful reunification. They think they can, and I think they're probably right, work out an arrangement with Beijing, similar to what Beijing did in Hong Kong. So we are now pouring another $1 billion plus of equipment into Taiwan. We're actively encouraging them to flirt with independence. And Xi has said this is a red line for us. Has to remind us again, we will not tolerate that. So under those circumstances, what are the incentives for the Chinese not to intervene on the side of Iran in a collision in the Middle East? Well, there aren't any. The Russians don't have any. We've lied to them repeatedly about everything. Now we'll say, well, that's not true. We've had to try to negotiate. The problem is whatever was said at Anchorage has vanished, like flatulence on the wind. They finally figured it out. Oh, well, Trump says a lot of things, but what does he actually mean? And more important, what can he do to deliver? This is the problem people are having with President Trump right now. They expected him to do certain things. First of all, none of them expected him to go overseas and start new wars and interventions. But they did expect him to deal decisively with millions of people that came here illegally. They expected him to enforce the law and defend the borders. It hasn't happened. Bits and pieces have, but as soon as he's run into opposition in a place like Minnesota from card-carrying leftists who hate him and despise him and will oppose the rule of law, what did he do? He backed off. So people are saying, what are you doing? And Venezuela, we now have Mr. Rubio saying that he wants to see the national budget on a monthly basis. Well, good luck. And anybody who knows anything about Latin America, those people down there are rolling in the streets laughing. Sure, let's send him this. Who are we kidding? Trump keeps trying to create the illusion that he controls the world everywhere. He doesn't. Not only does he not, we don't need to. It's not in our interest to try. But he's creating these illusions. And the same illusion is being built around Iran. If you don't do what we say, we're going to punish you. But they may not want to be punished. They may decide to punish us. And we should not underestimate that impact.
Yeah, and especially exactly as you're noting there, I mean, the U.S. is not picking just one conflict. It's not, we're just going to focus on Iran. No, they have conflicts going on everywhere, wars going on everywhere. And I know that for Trump, he can be a bit of a showman, right? He wants to claim, I've solved all of these wars. Look at all of these peace agreements. But when you really look at it, you go, okay, how much are we actually accomplishing here? Because you look at the war in Ukraine in particular, we're nearly 4 years into this. And even though, yes, we've had these various talks, exactly as you pointed out, when we get close to an agreement, when we get the idea of an agreement, the Trump administration then goes and does the opposite. And they support more of not only this war, but also these ongoing individual terror attacks targeting Russia in their homeland. When it comes down to the war in Ukraine and really this proxy war against Russia, how do you see the current state of it, even as the Trump administration is trying to make it look like they're just the third party mediator here?
I think President Putin has been waiting, and I'm glad he has, for dramatic change in the governments of Europe, particularly in London, Paris, and Berlin. I think London is very close to bidding farewell to Starmer, and his successor, whoever he is, presumably from the Labour Party, is probably not going to be welcome. I think we're going to see something along the lines of open rebellion in England against the government, because the things it's doing domestically are horrific. When you go to France, Macron is the butt of everybody's joke. He's trying to pretend publicly that he's Talleyrand or Cardinal Richelieu or something. He's not. The notion that he could go to Moscow and speak for anybody and be taken seriously is a joke. The Russians aren't paying much attention to him. He's a fool. And this brings us to Merz, Mr. BlackRock, former BlackRock associate and a central banker. What a catastrophe. I mean, that man is doing nothing that's in the interest of the German people. He's deindustrializing the place and put Germany on the path to national economic suicide. And simultaneously, all these countries are overrun by people they don't want, that will never be them, and indeed are taking the position that the Europeans in those countries should become like them. So Putin has exercised prudently restraint when dealing with these people. We're now seeing Poland change. Polls in Poland suggest the Polish people don't want anything to do with the war in Ukraine. That's good news because there's no country in the world that is more incurably anti-Russian than Poland. I think the world is changing. We don't necessarily feel it here, but it is changing, and it's moving in a direction of what I would call rationality and balance. The notion of going to war with Russia makes no sense to most Europeans. They're not flooding the recruiting stations so they can all suit up and march off to eastern Ukraine and fight the Russians. It's nonsense. They're beginning to figure out the Russians aren't coming. The Russians aren't interested in doing anything in Europe other than business. So he's been waiting for these things, but he still has to move. He has to advance. And I think that's what we're going to see in the spring. I think the Russians will move to Dnipro, and then I think they'll head south and take Odessa. I can't imagine that not happening because Odessa is an open wound. It continues to bring in equipment and mercenaries and other things that the Ukrainians need to keep going. That's unacceptable. And it's historically a Russian city. It was never part of historic Ukraine. Then there's Kharkov. And they have forces that they can take the city of Kharkov with. But the real question then remains is what do you do about Kiev? Do you let it sit there and continue to sort of metastasize as this cancerous tumor on Ukraine, or do you cross the river and root out the government and get rid of it? People think, oh, well, that's too much trouble. I don't think it is, especially if your goal is to crush that leadership without necessarily staying. But then again, the Russians have to ask the question, and I'm sure they are. You know that from your own experience. If we go there and we do this, do we stay or do we leave? Initially, when they went into eastern Ukraine, there was no plan to stay. And in Luhansk and Donetsk, the people came out and said, thank God you're here. It took you long enough. And they were told by Russian commanders, well, we're not staying. We'll be here until a negotiated settlement happens, then we're going back. And then they looked at them and said, well, then don't come. Don't stay here. As soon as you pull out, the Ukrainian secret police will show up and put bullets in our heads. Don't you understand what's happening? It took a few months, but finally by June, I think President Putin fundamentally understood that truth. So things had to change. They're going to have to answer the same question when they cross the Dnieper River and go into Kiev, if they do that. And again, that might not happen if, in fact, there's new leadership in Europe and they're willing to sit down and honor an agreement. See, that's the other problem. Who do we trust? If you're a Russian, we've trusted you in the past. We went through Minsk, went through these other things. It's very tough. And now they're very frustrated with President Trump because they really thought there was some sort of understanding reached. The Russians made a fundamental mistake. If it's not on paper and it's not signed, it doesn't exist. And so now they're stuck. And I think they realize we've got to press ahead. So I think they're going to focus myopically on Ukraine, wipe out whatever remains west of the Dnieper River, take those cities I mentioned, and then see who's actually in power.
Yeah, and you had that first year of Trump's second term, right, where Russia was trying to work with him. A lot of these countries have tried to work with him, and now they're seeing that not only him, but the US government as a whole cannot be trusted in a lot of these places, or will use and abuse these negotiations, and in the case of Iran, attack anyway. And you have the US over here provoking everyone at this point. I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a defense and foreign policy analyst and former Pentagon advisor, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Sure, thank you.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.